The tragic collapse of a Surfside condominium prompted a series of legislative reforms that some now say could prompt a different kind of collapse, this time an economic one. Here to tell us about it is Jacksonville real estate attorney Barry Ansbacher. Good morning, Barry. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
And we should say that Ansbacher Law is an underwriter of WJCT Public Media. Barry, I wanted to get into some of the changes that led to this moment, but if you can, could you just explain what we're seeing right now when people are talking about a condo crisis in Florida?
Well, really, what we're looking at is just like everybody's housing and household expenses, the cost of staying in a condo's gone up. You have the issues of just homeowners insurance is the same thing for a condominium, only you have that many more units. So they're facing that pressure. You're also facing the issue of the cost of maintenance, the cost of management, the cost of personnel, all those operating costs in a condominium are costs that the owners of those condominiums have to pay. And that is certainly putting pressure on just the operating budget, even before you get to the new legislation that followed the Surfside tragedy.
And how does the new legislation come into play? We've seen that as a sticking point for a lot of people who say, it raised the bar on how we have to put aside money as condo owners. It created this new threshold of needing inspections that could also tack costs on. Can you explain to us kind of what those regulations put into motion and how much you credit them with being part of what people are calling this crisis?
Certainly. What happened is really going back, not the current legislative cycle, which is wrapping up, but go back 2 cycles ago. So not even 24, but going back to 23. And in 2023, following the Champlain Towers, there was an evaluation over how did they get there. And when they did the studies, they said some of it was the original design, some of it was the construction. But one of the concerns that they really focused on is was that condominium association properly maintaining and dealing with deferred maintenance and structural issues? And the outcome of that was a belief that too many condominium associations were not properly keeping up their buildings or reserving the money to do so. And what happens is it's like anything else. If you've saved up for a new car and the money's in there and your car is, just won't start, it's a lot easier to go buy that new car if the money's in the bank account. And that's really a reserve fund that condominiums have always had to keep up with. But what they found is many, many condominium associations were not funding those reserves. So while the boards were required to budget for them, the membership could always override that reserve budget. And it was very, very common that they'd say, well, we'll do it next year. We'll do it next year. So as these deferred maintenance, as these large capital expenses came due, the directors didn't have the money in the budget because those reserves weren't there to do so. And the belief is that that caused them to push it even further and to do the minimal necessarily or really to avoid keeping up the buildings and keeping them in a safe condition.
And so the legislature basically issued a couple of requirements. One is something that I think you refer to as like the milestone money, and then kind of reserve study money. Can you explain what those requirements are, how they're separate, and what they ask of condo boards?
Certainly. What it comes down to is the issue of how we regulate building safety. We have a regimen that when you first construct a building or remodel, you have design and permits and inspections. But in general, there's no duty to ongoing inspect and make sure those buildings remain in a safe condition. If the building or code department becomes aware of something, then they would address it, but not on an ongoing basis. Now, Miami-Dade County, ironically, where Surfside occurred, had long had a 40-year certification program that buildings, when they got to be 40 years old, had to be inspected. Nowhere else really in the state had that. So what the milestone inspection does is really takes that Miami-Dade program and makes it statewide. So if you're dealing with buildings which are condominium and they have to be 3 or more stories, so it doesn't affect 1 and 2 stories or even small 3 stories. The first requirement is that they have an engineer or an architect come out and visually inspect the property and say, is there things here which present themselves as concern? If the answer is no, they're done. If they visually see anything of concern, the engineer or architect is required to perform testing, maybe remove wall segments, things like that, and do a phase two and determine if, in fact, there are concerns, and then write a report that gets sent to the building department and the homeowners in the condominium and the board that says these are things of concern that need to be repaired
Immediately.
immediately or certainly in the short term. And that's called the milestone inspection report. That is when a building reaches 30 years of age. But if it's a building that the local building department considers to be at higher risk, typically oceanfront, the building department can trigger that inspection for the first time at 25 years.
Okay. And then deferred maintenance or this reserve maintenance fund, that's something that boards are now kind of more rigorously required to set aside money for.
Correct. The two aspects of it is the milestone inspection is designed to fix the past problems, to go back to all these buildings where for years they haven't been properly inspecting or maintaining them or repairing them. That's trying to fix all the problems in the past. The legislative plan to avoid this happening in the future was to have the reserve accounts as non waivable. So they picked these structural items, roof, building painting, major things that would be over $10,000 that are life safety. So, for example, the pool furniture doesn't fall into this. So, there may be other reserves that are for lifestyle or amenities that the associations can continue to reserve or waive as they choose. But for these structural items, what they really wanted to do is to give some teeth to the reserve laws and say for these reserves, these structural integrity items, they had to be established, and for any budget adopted this year, January 1, 2025 forward. So generally, this will roll into effect with the 26 budgets because they adopt the budgets typically in November, December of the preceding year. So the 25 fiscal budgets were adopted last year, so they were before this implementation date. But the structural integrity reserve requirements have really two components. One is it sets the standard for these reserves that they have to be done by an architect, by an engineer, or by a structural integrity reserve designee who has certain special certifications from some accrediting agencies. They have to do that study and they have to report these studies to the state, and then they have to reserve money so that the funding requirements for when a roof would need to be replaced, when structural items need to be addressed, that those items are funded. And unlike reserves in the past, the membership can't waive those.
And this is sort of what has led to this um, kind of moment because those deadlines were supposed to take place at the first of the year. They were supposed to be, meeting these deadlines for these assessments, for these inspections. And you have a lot of condo boards saying we can't or just not responding. You have a lot of condo owners saying we are being forced out. We can't afford to live in these places anymore. And so and even places that people aren't being forced out of, I think, we all know somebody that's been trying to sell a condo and they say, "Well, the HOA has gone up so much, I can't sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. It's doubled since I bought it. Now is almost as much as the mortgage on the condo." So, um, what do you believe is driving that particular, like, pricing out?
Well, the real issue is are the monthly assessments or annual assessments artificially high now because of the legislation, or I would argue that they were always understated. If you go back to when a developer develops a condominium project, they have every incentive to make the assessments as low as possible because it makes the homes more attractive. And when you have directors who are serving, they're not going to be popular with their neighbors. They don't want to have to walk their dog at 2 a.m. in the morning to avoid their neighbors because they increased the assessments. So there's a lot of pressure to keep them down artificially, but some things just can't be helped. Insurance costs are going to go up and they can't avoid paying them. And these milestone inspection reports and structural integrity reserve studies are really forcing people to face the reality of what's always been there. Roofs have always worn out. Concrete with rebar in it has always had problems with the rusting of the rebar with the salt, air, and corrosion. So these things in terms of buildings wearing out have always happened. The issue has been, have people been properly recognizing that and accounting for it, or have they been willfully ignorant for it and kind of just kicking the can? And I think that's really what this is. And I know that our own Senator Bradley has been all over the state and working on this legislation, has been the lead for many years. And I heard her say it at a panel. We were at University of Florida on a public policy panel. Is we're not changing things with these laws in terms of affordability. We're just really shining a light on what has always been the condition. Whether you had the reserve requirement or not, in other words, that you're paying each month, or you got to the back end and now the building is collapsing and you have a special assessment for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, either way, the building maintenance needs to be done and the safety needs to be maintained. It's, are you paying as you go, or are you going to have these unaffordable, huge special assessments on the back end, or possibly have the condominium just go into bankruptcy or be terminated because it just can't be maintained as a safe structure? So I think it really is in large part dealing with the truth of the situation. I don't believe this is one that the legislature is creating the burden. I think they're really simply causing people to be realistic about what it costs to stay in these buildings.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to real estate attorney Barry Ansbacher about Florida's condo crisis. If you have comments or questions, you can join the conversation. Give us a call at 904 549 2937. You can also email questions or comments to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org, or you can tag us on social media. And I hear what you're saying, Barry. It costs what it costs. And yet, there's been so much reporting on this issue. Um, by the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald. There was a story in the Palm Beach Post that was particularly striking of a homeowner that they interviewed who said, I bought this condo. My mortgage is $300 a month. He bought it in 2006, and his fees are now $2,100 a month. And so that is the real cost, as you would say, of what this condo costs. And yet it is clearly going to put people out of their homes if they are on a fixed income, or just like anybody who can't afford to see their, mortgage effectively quintupled um, on a monthly basis. Is there something fundamental about the way that condos operate, are designed, work, that is flawed somehow?
I think the issue that you have is governance. In some condominiums, you've always had good governance and they've handled the reserves and they've properly managed their buildings and maintained them. But in other communities, there's just been a failure of the leadership of those condominiums, the boards, because they nobody is a hero when they're raising assessments. And I think what happens is it's built up over 25, 30, 40 years. If you had been properly maintaining a lot of these buildings as you've gone along and properly reserving, they wouldn't be upside down. But think about it. If you've not done any maintenance on your car for 3 years and you take it into the service shop, it's going to need a lot more than if you're getting the oil changed every 6 months. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing, that these assessments have been artificially low. Now, there's certainly other issues that are driving it, just like businesses and people in their own household finances are having expenses go up. The cost of services has gone up. And of course, the cost of insurance, despite the so called insurance reform that went through that was supposed to reduce rates, that has gone up significantly as well. So all those costs get passed through to the homeowners. There's nobody else to pay it. So if the condominium insurance cost goes up 30%, well, that's going to go through to each homeowner. Is going to have to pay their share of that. So you have a lot of factors working in terms of just the cost of living and inflation, and all those things are pushing through to the condo fees.
We've got a call from Robin on the South Side. Good morning, Robin. Go ahead.
Good morning. My question is around the comment you made earlier. You said if the architect or the engineer deems that the property can't be repaired and it needs to be or would be abandoned, who pays for the removal or destruction of that property? That's very expensive. So I was just wondering who would pay for that cost.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, let me clarify a little bit. What the architect or engineer, in terms of these studies, is doing is determining not whether it can't be repaired, but whether a repair is required. In other words, if they walk around and visually and it looks good and they don't see anything, then that's through and done. But if they walk through, for example, let's say they see cracking in the cement or they see rusting of rebar coming through, then what they're going to do is do further examination. In the same way, like if you go to your family physician and he sees no reason for further testing, but maybe there's something suspicious and you get an MRI or an X ray. It works like that. Whether something can be repaired or not, pretty much most things can be repaired. The issue that comes up is if the repair cost of a condominium is so extensive that it really exceeds the value of the condominium. In other words, if each home is worth $100,000 and the cost of repair exceeds the value of all the homes, in those instances, the legislature does have procedures whereby the members can vote to terminate the condominium, where instead of repairing it, they sell the building as is, and each of the homeowners gets their share of the sales proceeds.
So somebody buys it and they either do the repairs or they tear it down and start anew.
Exactly, but the architect or engineer is not making those decisions. They're really just providing information that the board of directors and the homeowners can act upon.
Got a call from John on the South Side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello, this is John. I have three questions actually. The first is how does insurance calculate in the reserve studies? Because most likely these defects in the building, especially the roof, would going to be covered by insurance in case there's an accident, and we have, in that case, there would be a new roof with 30, 40 years lifespan. So how does that calculate in the reserve, knowing that the reserve is mostly related to the roof? Second question is, Mr. Ansbacher mentioned 3-story small buildings. I'm not aware of that small definition. As far as I know, it's 3 stories and up. You're covered by that law. And the last question is, I read the new proposed rules, and it seems like there is an aspect where if you can attain a line of credit in lieu of funding the reserve, that would be one way to mitigate the funding. I'm not sure if I interpreted it right, but
Yeah,
I'll
that's a
take
good
my
question. Thanks, John. I think those are all things that Barry can answer. So let's start. He was wondering if there are in the reserve studies, if they're calculating the, for instance, the insurance.
Well, the insurance is really considered separate, even though there is a relationship. If you have defects in construction or maintenance that hasn't been done and you get a hurricane or tropical storm, it typically is going to invite more damage because a well maintained roof is going to be more resistant. But the reserve studies are based upon just useful life or deferred maintenance or defects. So they don't take into account what if a hurricane or fire or storm came in. The assumption is that there won't be a casualty, but just with the current condition of those roof and structures and elevators in the passage of time, what will be required to maintain or replace or repair.
And
And
reserve funds don't pay for insurance or insurance increases.
correct, insurance is going to be an annual operating a cost. Now, because insurance coverage has gotten more challenging with the new laws, and for example, water and mold damage is limited or excluded on so many policies, some prudent condominium and homeowner associations are having not necessarily reserve, but more of a sinking fund to cover deductibles or uncovered losses. But that's really not what these structural integrity reserves are requiring. That's really just a business decision of those associations.
Okay, and his question about buildings that are required to abide by these rules being basically 3 stories and up.
There's an exception for duplexes, I think maybe 4 or 6. So when you have some very, very small condominiums, but for what we would consider the typical condominium, it's an unusual circumstance. I've had condominiums with as few as 2 units for uh, particular reasons. So those are not included. They're really looking at what we would consider the ordinary condominium complex.
Kind of a tower, yeah. And then, in terms of the rules, about getting credit to help offset some of these reserve requirements, tell us about what that allows for.
We deal with this frequently, and most condominium documents provide whether the board of directors has the authority to borrow money or whether the membership has to approve a loan. So loans to condominium associations are not new, and they've been used for as long as I've been practicing law to help fund repair projects or enhancements. And that's really just the condominium association borrows money, and then through future assessments, they repay the loan. So it doesn't really change the cost. It's simply a different way of financing it rather than homeowners having to have a special assessment or go get the money through their own sources. The association can sometimes facilitate it easier by getting one loan for the whole project. That doesn't change the reserves going forward, but if you have a milestone inspection that says you have hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in immediate repairs, then your only choices to pay for that are going to be a special assessment on the members, typically payable in very short time, or they can borrow money to stretch those payments out longer. The legislation that's proposed on the House version of the bill, 913, is not changing the ability to borrow as a concept, but it's changing the way in which the approval is done. If the House bill becomes law, then it provides that the board has the right to borrow money without membership approval. So essentially, if membership approval is required in the condo docs, it overrides that to make it easier for the board to get a loan.
The board could decide to get a loan even if it doesn't have that the vote of all of the condo owners.
Exactly. It's really just designed to facilitate the process. It doesn't really change the underlying idea of if you borrow money, you're still paying for it. It's just how you pay for it.
And I wanna talk to you about the possibility of investing that money as an option, but I first wanna get to a call from John in St. John's. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for covering this topic. Given the recent incidents in Jacksonville, like the Phoenix Art Building collapse into Main Street and the city's neglect of its own properties, like 324 Broad Street in La Villa next to the courthouse, where the roof collapsed as well, shouldn't more scrutiny be placed on local government's role in enforcing building security and safety, possibly by the state? And secondly, do you know if the state knows how many condos actually were required to turn in the milestone reports? Because I've asked the city of Jax through public information requests for months about the numbers, and they still don't know. They haven't reported that information to me. They don't know how many of the 167 associations were required to turn in the reports. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I mean, you actually have a list, I think, of those associations with you, don't you?
Right. I pulled from the Division of Condominiums. They have a registry of condominium associations as their structural integrity reserve studies have been completed. And I printed out the numbers of Jacksonville condominiums that have fulfilled that requirement through self-reporting. I don't know what the number is in terms of how many that leaves out that haven't performed that yet. There's still a grandfather year coming up for that to be completed under certain circumstances. So they're not necessarily delinquent in doing that. But John raises a really good question that's come up of if we're concerned about building safety and building collapse, why only condominiums, an office building, an apartment building, a bridge? And he's absolutely right. The maintenance of infrastructure, the passage of time, the effect of salt air on corrosion happens to all buildings, bridges, and structures. Mother Nature doesn't care what the form of ownership is. And that's been brought up as a question as to whether the focus just on condominiums is appropriate or if it should be given a broader analysis. And I think the way I get there is the legislature typically is reactive. So Champlain Towers was a condominium. This legislation was pushed in large part in response to that. I imagine if the tragedy had been an apartment complex or a courthouse, we may have had legislation focused in that direction, and it may be something that ultimately is addressed, but,
Sure,
um,
and to bridges, I mean, we are seeing inspections after the Francis Scott Key collapse, so it does animate lawmakers, certainly. Um, I want you to explain because one of the proposals that's before the legislature would allow for some investment of those reserve funds. Can you explain what that would, who that would benefit, and why some people are concerned?
well, one of the issues is how do you get the money to pay for the repairs and deferred maintenance and construction defects? I mean, that's the big question. And one of the ways people have contemplated doing it, and this is in Senator Bradley's bill, is maybe instead of just putting the money into money market or savings accounts or insured certificate of deposits, which is what the standard is now, could we allow investing into stocks or bonds so that you get more return on investment and therefore the money would grow faster and there'd be more funds available? And I understand that to be a positive goal. I personally have concerns having dealt with condominium boards of different sophistication, whether despite the safeguards that the bill is trying to build in, I'm really concerned that worse than not getting maybe that extra 2 or 3% return, that the money is not wisely invested and that less sophisticated condominiums might be preyed upon by unscrupulous um, uh, people to improperly invest the money. But that is in the Senate bill, not the House bill.
All right. We have a call from Sal in Fruit Cove. Good morning, Sal. Just briefly go ahead if you can, please.
Sure, sure. Thank you for taking my call. Number one, being a 65-year-old man, realizing that the costs are going to go up, and I planned that for my retirement, but I had no clue that it was going to jump to this proportion. So just wanted to make everybody be aware, the 30-year-olds that are on the call listening, save up because inflation is real, as we know with the food and gasoline and everything else occurring in our political climate. But it's a great topic that you bring up, and it's not just going to stop with the condos. It's going to spread. So just for you 30-somethings that are out there listening, start banking some money.
Yeah.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Good advice, Sal. Thank you. Just in the last minute or so we have, Barry, can you kind of tell us what you're expecting to see from the legislature as we sort of come down to the wire on this session, and what people who live in condos or are thinking about buying condos should sort of be thinking about? Um, should they be paying attention to anything in particular when it comes to these bills?
I think the legislation, if it passes the House or the Senate bill, is going to make some adjustments to these processes. But the idea that they're going to go back to the old regime where each condominium association could choose to be prudent and maintain their reserves or waive them, I don't think those days are coming back. It's going to be whether there's a little bit of flexibility in the funding or not, whether there is some ability to finance. So I think the legislature's already taken the step to implement the pay as you go methodology and enforce it. And I don't think that's ever going to go back to the way it was. I just think that there are going to be some hardships. There's no question. But I don't think that in and of itself is going to cause the legislature to retreat because I think they recognize and take the position that these problems were always occurring. It's just that people weren't dealing with them. And they're going to stay the course, is what I say.
And then I did kind of allude to or mention the blacklists, which has been something that's been getting a lot of attention. And that's basically when we're seeing mortgage lenders refusing to issue to underwrite loans to these companies or to these, excuse me, to these condos that are in arrears or haven't done this maintenance. Is that something that is going to be impacting this region as much as South Florida?
The mortgage brokers I've talked to have not seen that as a problem here, but there really are two buckets of people who are buying and financing condominium purchases. Those who are what we call very well qualified are putting 25% down and have excellent credit. The underwriters there look less at the condominium project and more at the financial condition of the borrower. So they're less likely to have a loan rejected. But if you're not putting that much down or your credit maybe is not quite that sterling, the underwriters are giving greater scrutiny to what is the financial condition and the condition of the physical property of the condominium so that they may be rejecting loans before because they're concerned that the condominium association is not properly maintaining its accounts, or that there's going to be a huge special assessment coming that may prevent their borrower from meeting their financial obligations. And so, to the earlier question, what should you do as a buyer? I think you should sort of do what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is doing. If you see a beautiful condominium unit, remember you're buying more than just that unit, just that 3 bedrooms. You're buying a piece of the whole project. So work with a real estate attorney, work with your real estate agent, but really look at the association itself and give that as much scrutiny as you are the unit. And remember, you're buying into the whole project.
And I have to ask this just one last question because I saw that people can be held liable if they sell a condo, and there's been a discussion about some major assessment in the last 6 months. And even if they didn't know about it, it's in the minutes of the meeting. Can you just tell us briefly what the responsibility is there?
Well, Florida law has long been that if you're selling a residential property, you have a duty to disclose known material latent defects. And that's really what would a reasonable buyer want to know. So obviously, a special assessment coming up, or if you're aware or it's been published that the building has structural issues, that's something I think a buyer would want to know. And we're seeing a real uptick in legal claims that buyers have been bringing against sellers alleging non-disclosure or fraud, and that's certainly not something people want to have. That phone call or that letter, 6 months after they sell, that I wod like the purchase price or at least a good portion of it back.
All right. A lot of complicated issues. Thank you for coming on, Barry Ansbacher, to help us thread through some of that and to keep an eye on the legislative session.
Thank you.